Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yo, anyways, my name is Philip Henderson. I'm from Southern California. Southern California in the house? Yeah, okay. That's right, San Diego. Yeah. Um, I put this here because it says if you want to travel fast, travel alone. I don't travel fast. I was alone, but I wasn't really alone. Next slide, please. But if you want to go far, you go together. I've always had people with me. I've always had a community, but it didn't come easy. A lot of people know me as the leader of Full Circle Expedition, which was a Everest expedition last year, which was the first all-black team to summit Everest in, in history. Um, my life didn't start by saying I want to go climb Everest or be a leader of an Everest expedition, but I was tied to it in a sense, simply because of when I was born. Um, I was born in 1963, before a lot of people here were even thinking about being born. But I was born into a world of, just 4 months before I was born, the first American expedition had summited Everest in 1963. But 4 months, actually 4 days after I was born, was the March on Washington. So I was really born into civil rights, into that era. First year, 8, 9 years of my life, this is what it was. It was church, community. My community was all black. The school I went to was all black, except you can see on there was one white person in my class. But in 1972, my father was literally allowed to buy a house. And that's kind of where things changed. Next slide. It changed in a way that I didn't know. I was 8 years old. But when I went to school, it really seemed different. My community was different. The neighborhood I lived was all white. The school I went to was all white. I was one black kid in the class. Next slide, please. But 2 years later, as you can see, things were starting to change a little bit. And so I've always had different people in my lives, whether they were all black or just different. But as we were living in that neighborhood, diversity started happening. So I was growing up with what we're looking at trying to build right now, almost 58 years ago, 52 years ago. By the time I was in middle school, desegregation was happening. They were busing kids from the other side of town to where I lived at. But I didn't ride the bus. So to those kids, I was different. But to the kids I lived with and went to school with, I was different. So I didn't know where I fit. Next slide. The common thing for me was sports. And I've always been an athlete. Baseball, football. Next slide. From the time I was 8 until I was in college. Now, football that was my life. I had cousins that played professional football. I was on my way to a 4-year college, a 4-year scholarship, actually 2 years because I was in junior college at the time. But this was the last time I would wear a football uniform there in the red and black. I had an injury in a game. I fractured a vertebrae in my neck. And I laid on the ground, paralyzed from the neck down. For the next year and a half or so, you can keep it there, yeah. For the next year and a half, I was disabled. I didn't do anything. I couldn't go to school. I couldn't work. I could just sit around and picked up bad habits, smoking, drinking, watching TV, things like that, because I was depressed. I didn't know what to do because football was my life. So I had a lot of time to think because I had this life-changing experience. And about when I was about 8 or so, my uncle took me fishing. And that stuck with me. So when I was actually able to do something, there were two things I did. One is I learned to play golf. So when I'm here, it's nice to be on a golf course. But I started playing golf when I was 20. But I started thinking, what am I going to do with my life? And so I went into a state park and I started fishing again. Well, going to that state park opened my mind to the outdoors. I noticed that there was a ranger. Like, whoa, it's a ranger, what is that? Because that wasn't something I knew about. And he explained to me what he did, and there was a volunteer program. So I volunteered in that program and I did these interpretive hikes. And it got me curious, like, wow, this outdoor stuff. So I went to a store to buy a pair of boots. And I asked someone, where do you learn more of this outdoor stuff? He gave me 2 telephone numbers, one to Outward Bound and one to Knowles, the National Outdoor Leadership School. And I had to call them to get them to send the catalog in the mail because the internet didn't exist at the time. And the Knowles catalog came in the mail first. That was my exposure to the outdoor industry back then. I think that was about 1989 when I got that catalog, maybe a little bit earlier. But I looked at that and I said, this is what I'm going to do. I didn't know anybody in the industry. I think I had skied once. A friend of mine took me skiing. He said, this is how you stop. Let's go. Took me to the top of the mountain. I think I had climbed once as well. It was an artificial climb. It was on a pillar of a highway overpass with holes drilled into the cement. That was the first artificial climbing that I ever did. Climbing gym didn't really, I think there may have been 2 or 3 in the country at that point in time. Next slide. I quit my job. People didn't believe I was going to do that. But I knew I didn't want to go into a Costco warehouse for the next 25 or 30 years and retire and have a house and all those different things. I wanted to do something different. So I saved my money. I hustled for the next couple years. 1992, I took a Knowles course. And I've been working in the outdoor industry ever since then. But when I started, Knowles had been operating for already about 30 years. And I was the first Black American instructor to work there. From 94 to 99, I was the only Black instructor that worked there. I didn't know, when I came into it, I didn't know what the future held. I just knew that I wanted to do this for work. I wanted to do that. I was working for $40 a day back then. My parents didn't think I had a job, actually. My father would ask me, when are you going to get a job? I said, Pop, I have a job. Next slide. Opportunities are something that don't come easy. We had Elle yesterday who was saying, you have to kind of assert yourself. You got to insert yourself. You really have to look for opportunities. So I was working at REI, and there was a gentleman who was passing out some brochures for his whitewater program, and I just happened to be standing next to him. And something in my mind told him, ask him if he needs any guides. So I asked him, and he gave me work. That's how I got my first job in the outdoor industry, because I approached someone and asked him if I could work for them. He didn't hesitate. He just said, yeah, here's my number. Give me a call. Whitewater was not something that I was comfortable with at the time. I hated it, actually, so I don't know why I asked him about that job. But I ended up working for him for a couple of years. Next slide. But when I started working in the outdoor industry, for me, it was like taking a step backwards 25 years. Because the community that I came back into was like when I was back in the 3rd or 4th grade. It was all white and I was the only Black person. And it was like that everywhere. Youth programs, go ahead, next slide. I'm an L&T master. These are L&T master courses that I would work with land managers. Next slide. So when I was working for Knowles, I always realized one thing was that people are benefiting, people are growing tremendously through this education, through this outdoor education program. But none of those people come from my community. It wasn't for me about getting more Black people in. It was about having access to education, outdoor education, and learning that. And that wasn't something that was going in my community. So I was always looking for opportunities to bring other people in. Next slide. When I went home, my mother was my biggest advocate, should I say. And she would always say, oh, my son's home. And she would have people come over to the house and they would ask, oh, you do that stuff? I want to do it. And so back in 1999, I started taking people out. If you want to come out, I'll teach you. And so I was having folks from Los Angeles, different communities, come to Wyoming where I was living just to give them that experience of outdoors. Go ahead, next slide. Next one. But at the same time, I had to practice my own craft as well. I had to get proficient at a lot of skills. Otherwise, I could only work about that much of the year. Go ahead, next slide. I've always been a skier. That's something I've done. That's the one thing I've done for the last 37 years. That's what I do. That's what gets me. And Andrew asked someone earlier, what gets you up in the morning? Skiing gets me up in the morning. Yeah. 4 o'clock, 3 o'clock, doesn't matter, but I want to go skiing. Next slide. I don't consider myself a climber, actually. Yes, I am a climber, but I don't get pigeonholed into just being a climber. I'm an outdoor professional is what I do. I climb, I ski, I boat, I bike, I fish. And so I know that there's something out there for everybody. If one thing doesn't work, try something new. Go ahead, next slide. I had mentioned about being the only Black American instructor at Knowles. Well, what I found out was, Knowles had been operating in Kenya for 25 years, and they had Kenyan instructors who were Black. So in 2000, I actually went to Kenya to work. And they had never seen a Black person from America before. And so when I went there, they asked on the coast, the sailors asked, they said, so you mean he was born here in Kenya and then he moved to the U.S. and forgot how to speak Swahili and now he's back here? And they said, no, he was born in America. And they're, oh, pole sana, which means we're so sorry. Lakini karibu yumbani, so they were saying, but welcome home. There are other stories I can tell you, but during that period of time is when I kind of said, I want to connect people. I have this connection. I want to connect other people with our culture. While I was in Kenya, I also got married, so my wife is from Kenya before I came home. But the biggest thing is I was working with land managers. I was working with porters and guides on Mount Kenya and Kilimanjaro as training. Next slide. This was Kilimanjaro in my first trip in 2000. And you can see along the top there, there's a lot of snow on that mountain. That was in 2000. I just recently came back from Kilimanjaro 2023. Most of that snow is gone. Next slide. And the next one. My high altitude training started on Mount Kenya and Kilimanjaro. But then I went to Denali as well. And again, it's about opportunities. The same way that I asked someone for a job in Whitewater, someone else provided an opportunity, someone that I worked for, and he said, man, you're solid. If you ever want to work in Alaska, just call me. So I had some time. 2005, I got the opportunity to guide in Alaska on Denali. All of that kind of built me up. I had high altitude training. I was an educator. I had been to Denali as well. And then I met someone, and his name's Conrad Anker. I didn't know who Conrad was when I met him, actually. But I said to him, I would love to volunteer for your Kumbu climbing school. And Conrad was like, yeah, man, you're in, let's go. So 2006, I went to this little village in Nepal, Fort Say. Next slide. Where the Kumbu climbing school operates. Now, the climbing school was started to help train Sherpas because they have a higher mortality rate than Western climbers. And that program, which was to increase the safety margin of Nepali climbers in a community environment. To me, that sounds like an affinity group. That sounds like what we're doing here, building community for folks to actually learn and build that foundation. So this gave me, I didn't have students that looked like me. I didn't have instructors that looked like me working in the United States. But when I went to Nepal, I was appreciated a little bit more. My students in Nepal, some of them had been to Everest 9, 10 times. They had never seen a person as dark as me teaching them something, and they didn't have very many skills. And that's what I brought to the table, and Conrad recognized that. I went back, and I kept going back, I kept going back. I went to Nepal 5 times. Keep the next slide. They became family. But I also wanted the Nepalis and Sherpa folks to know me as more than a climber. I wanted them to know me as well, at the time I didn't have a child, but I wanted them to know me as a husband, as a friend, something other than a climber. But when I went to Everest the first time in 2012, I worked with folks that I had helped train. Some of those folks I had given scholarships to take a NOLS course. They had come to the US, stayed at my house. So they know me, they remember when my daughter was born. I know their children in Nepal. I know their families and so on. And I had been with them on the mountain. Next slide. This was that famous crew. So again, it's about building community, and my community being built was Conrad. It was Jim, the guy who gave me the first job. It was Colby. And as things kept moving forward, Sam Elias is on this trip as well. Sam was my teammate here. Next slide. But after Everest, yeah, it's up there. It's like the ultimate. People go to Everest, that's the last of, that's the ultimate for them. It's the culmination of their career. For me, I went to Everest the first time, and a month later, I was back to teaching youth how to fish, how to cook fish, and introducing them into the outdoors. That's always been something that I want to do, is because I don't want to be the only one. I want that to keep going. Next slide. But I actually started at home. When my daughter was born, I realized that, my life's got to change. I didn't want her to have a different life than I had. I didn't leave the country until I was 39 years old. I didn't ski and all those things until I was over 27. My daughter was on skis when she was 1. Next slide. We spent time in Chile, and I learned something about children in that they watch everything you do. They learn just by watching. And I remember my daughter asking me one day, she's like, "Daddy, I want to go fly fishing." I had taken her fishing, and she had a fly rod in her hand, but she was on the bank. And I asked her, "How was your fishing?" She's like, "Great, but I want to go fly fishing." Like, "You just did." She's like, "No, I want to stand in the water." So I let her stand in the water. Found a place for her to fish. But she was 6 years old at the time when she was fly fishing, when she started. And I noticed that she was watching everything that I had been doing. And she was a pretty good fisher person at that time. Next slide. So I was doing what I need to do with my own family as well as outside the family, bringing people into the outdoor industry and giving them that experience. All of the things that I had done previous to that is what led to this next expedition, Full Circle Everest expedition. Conrad and I had talked about it for years, and I had been out of the country. I came back, and there was the industry had just changed from 2000. I was out of the country 2013 to 16. Affinity groups were happening. People were engaged in climbing, and someone called me and asked, "Hey, can you come and do this presentation for Black History Month?" And I'm like, "How do you even know who I am?" And she's like, "Oh, Phil, well, everybody knows who you are. You're a legend." These are people that didn't exist in the outdoors for years. And so I realized that I had only an obligation, but I had community, people who were wanting something from me, and I had something to give to them. So through all of those things, Conrad and I talked, and I was out of the country, came back. I met Fred and Dom, I met Manoa, and we started this process of building the team. We wanted our team to be gender neutral, but finding Black women with mountaineering skills was really, really hard. But because I had been on Denali in 2013, when the expedition Denali was there. I met a couple of other folks. Rosemary, who's sitting right here in front, was on that team, and Rosemary and I had also been on on Kilimanjaro together in 2018 when she guided with me. This was on Rainier. Our training program, it was a part of our training program, was just to get, spend time together. But the biggest thing, next slide, please. Again, folks in Nepal were like family to me. So the goal for us was not just going to Everest and climbing Everest, but my biggest goal was to connect people from my community here with my community in Nepal. I wanted more people to know about Sherpas and to be able to speak about the Sherpa culture and about Mount Everest from experience, not just from what they read in a magazine. But that still wasn't, we don't just build a team and say, hey, we're going to go to Everest as a black team. All of us had 6,000 meter experience or multiple 6,000 meter experiences. Next slide. So because I wanted them to be one team, I didn't want our climbing team and our Sherpa team. So in January of 2022, we all went to the KCC, the Khumbu Climbing School in January, and immersed ourselves into that program. My goal here was I wanted our team to, because no one else had been to Nepal before, I wanted them to know the food. I wanted them to know the culture. I wanted them to breathe the air, get that stuff in their gut. Get sick now before you go in April and get sick, if you're gonna get sick. But most of all, to build that community, to spend time with our Sherpas, the folks that were gonna be on our team. We had a great time. We spent a month together. And this is really what was building community. So by the time we went, next slide. The time we went to Everest, all the groundwork was done. We were tired, but there was still one foot to put in front of the other for the next 2 months. We talked about community building and so on. Again, I had been on Everest 10 years before that. And I wanted more people. The reason, this is the biggest statistic that we pulled up. When we started this expedition, we had known of 6 black people around the world who had climbed Everest. Just 6, not Americans, but 6 people around the world. And as we started moving down this line, another one came out, another one came out. By the time we went to Everest, we had known of 11 black people around the world who had summited Everest. 11 out of 10,000. It's less than 1%. The climbing community right now, black people and the African Americans in the climbing community is 1%. So we wanted to change that. But really, again, the goal was to change how we speak about Everest, how we speak about Sherpas, but we wanted to change that number as well. So in May 12th of 2022, 7 of our team members summited Everest, which took that number from 11 to 18 in one expedition. Next slide. Some of these, again, it was about opportunity, and the reason why I have these pictures here is because I think one of the biggest opportunities we had was high altitude camera person. There were no black high altitude cinematographers or camera folks that I knew of before 2022. And one of our teammates, Evan, who had never been out of the country, he'd only climbed and snowboarded in Colorado, got the opportunity to go to Everest and produce these photos. And he summited as well. Yeah. Next slide. Go ahead, next one. Cool. This was our 11-person team from here. There were 8 of us, 8 guys and 3 women. Next slide. This was our team. We were a total of 32 people. So 11, and then we added 21 folks. Half of them I knew from previous expeditions or being in Fort Say. One of them had been on our previous expedition as a cook and was our cook again this time. Next slide. So for me, it's always been about community and family and getting more people to engage in the outdoors. And again, there's always something you can do. We talked about it. It doesn't have to be the extreme. And people will hear me say this all the time. I don't care if it's sitting on a park bench, bird watching, or Everest. Anything in between that. If you want to get outside, get outside. We'll help you do that. That's the kind of community that we need. I believe to expose children to almost anything and everything possible. Someone said it earlier. It's like, just expose. You never know what's going to happen. Bring somebody in the door, expose them to something you never know where it's going to lead to. That's what happened to me. I was in a box, and that box was football, baseball, and other things. And you hear this all the time. People say, "Oh, let's think outside the box." Well, I had an injury, and that injury allowed me to actually live outside the box versus just thinking outside of it. And that's what I've always done since then. I've lived outside this box that society puts us in. Next slide. Why are we here? We're here to support the Memphis Rock community, to give them opportunities to experience something different. My relationship with the folks at Memphis Rock started a couple years ago, but I've been there twice. And just this year, just a month ago, this photo was at my house in Colorado, where I brought folks out from Memphis to just camp. Give them a comfortable place to camp with somebody they know and see some things that they may not have seen before. And it was funny because they got out of the van in the driveway and someone got out and said, "Wow, this is not Memphis." I said, "No, it's not." But you can see they had a chance to hang out with the goats. They have goats at home. Fire, next slide. Just camping, just being comfortable. That's just my next step. This is our goal, is to provide opportunities for people who would not normally have that opportunity. That's what I've always done outside of being an outdoor professional. And it's not just about black and brown people, although that is a big proponent of mine. I want to make sure that that happens because we don't want history to repeat itself. My community has always been very different. I speak 5 different languages. I can communicate in 5 different languages because I try. It's intentional. And I think we need to be intentional in how we build our communities. And building that community is important to our resources, to the environment. We can't save the environment. We can't look at global warming from one perspective. We need to bring other people in. That's how we get to the next step. So that's why we're here. We're supporting the folks from Memphis Rocks, giving them the best opportunity they can to experience life and have a better life within Memphis Rocks or outside of it. But we have to give them opportunities to make choices in their own lives. And that's what my job is right now. That's where my goals are right now. That's my determination right now, is to do the best I can do for those kids from Memphis Rocks. So what I'm asking you all to do as well, join Tom Shadyac, the board at Memphis Rocks, myself, Conrad, Sam, all of these folks who are putting in, countless hours and energy to Memphis Rocks to make that place sustainable. So thank you all for coming out and supporting this event, listening to me talk for a few minutes, listening to my music. I hope that music is sinking in your mind right now. Yeah, I've had a good life. I'm blessed. It wasn't something that was planned. I just kept going with opportunities. This is what I think about opportunities is that if you're in a position to provide an opportunity for someone, do it. Doesn't matter where they come from, what they look like. If you notice that that person is interested, provide an opportunity for them. Yeah. And those folks who are looking for opportunities, if there's an opportunity in front of you, take it. You never know where it's going to lead you. Don't be afraid to ask. You never know what's going to happen. You just got to ask. You never get anything if you don't ask, right? So they say that good things come to those who wait. Bullshit. Good things come to those who work for it, who work hard and seek opportunities. Thank you.